Everything's going? Okay. So I think there was a little bit of confusion. By the way, I need a glass of water if you can get me one whenever. Welcome, everyone. Tonight is our first meeting in the COVID era. George is very bravely wearing his mask and is here. Once again, we had finished last week Volume 4. We were going to go on to Volume 5 of Teachings for Victory, but we changed to go to Volume 1 to give the areas that don't have access to this yet some more time to get it. So a lot of people thought that, even from this group, thought we were going to go on to Volume 1 this week. We're not. As I mentioned, I've been waiting for years, literally, to share something that it's kind of like, it's not a Gosho lecture, it's not something like that. But to me, it's very, very meaningful, and I think it's important to share, because I don't know, maybe COVID-19 will get me, and before I go, I need to make sure that I know you all know this. I have my friend in India that's been talking to me recently. They just asked, pardon me. They said, it's very considerate of you to start from Volume 1 of the Teachings for Victory. I just got my book from study. Okay, da-da-da-da. We'll probably ask for a friend. Okay. Wanted to know, how did you establish a mentor-disciple bond? I'm only a decade old in this practice and want to understand how to deepen my bond with Sensei. At times I feel I am giving my all, and at times it feels like a maintenance practice. How to keep the fire of resolve burning? Daily gongyo and daimoku to the Gohonzon. That maintenance process is part of the reality of life. I mean, it's very, very difficult to have an ichinen that's correct every day, because every day you wake up, devil's going to attack your life condition. If you don't do the things to straighten your life condition out so you're thinking 10th world, you're not going to have those feelings or thoughts naturally. So to some degree, that's what you're striving to achieve every time that you get in front of the Gohonzon, is that fusion with the Gohonzon, that Kyochin Yoga. So the thing that we're reading tonight is The Human Revolution. Now this is a 2-volume set. I'll show you some other time. I didn't bring the second volume over. This is really the story of President Toda, written by President Ikeda. And I want to introduce this because I want everybody to understand why I constantly emphasize the fact that what I practice and what I'm emphasizing to all of you is basically, the Soka philosophy. As I discussed a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Nichiren Buddhism. There's a lot of schools of Nichiren Buddhism. They don't all believe in exactly the same manner. There's one right under the table there. There's a lot of Nichiren schools. So I want to read to you, I'll give you a little more of a background on that element of the reality of what Soka Gakkai has done as it relates to the Soka philosophy. And where did the Soka philosophy come from? Is it the invention of Daisaku Ikeda for the sake of trying to monopolize the minds of the membership of the Soka Gakkai? No. This is one of, what I'm going to read you is one of the reasons why I get so pissed off at people that slander the Soka Gakkai. Even though I don't practice with the Soka Gakkai, and I haven't practiced with the Soka Gakkai for 20 years. If you slander Daisaku Ikeda in the Soka Gakkai, as far as I'm concerned, you've got your head all the way up your ass. And I'm going to read to you now why I feel that way, because this is the historical reality to this. This isn't an opinion of a bunch of white people in America from the 60s or 70s. This is exactly actually how it went down in the 40s and 50s and 60s in Japan. And that's where everything else started. So before I go forward with that, though, a lot of people aren't really familiar with the fact that there are like 44 different schools of Nichiren Buddhism. So when you talk about Nichiren Buddhism, you have to be very specific, because it's a catch-all for a lot of different things. Where did I put this? And here it is. So the first thing I wanted to do was, if you guys go to www.nichirenlibrary.org, which has so generously been supplied to the world by Soka Gakkai, and you go to the dictionary, the Dictionary of Buddhism will be online. The whole thing's been volunteered for everybody to have free access to it. It's open source. So you go to page, actually, if I were you and I were doing this exercise, I would start with page 439, where it talks about Nietzsche, and it gives Nietzsche and his whole history and his biography. Okay, but the next thing over on page 445 is Nietzsche in school, and it says, in general, just to qualify, what do you mean by Nietzsche in school? In general, any Buddhist school that regards Nietzsche as its founder, or all such schools taken together, specifically the school whose head temple is Kuanji in Mount Minobu of Yamanashi Prefecture, Japan. Nietzsche nominated 6 senior priests among his disciples to lead the propagation of his teachings after his death. They were Nisho, Nichiro, Nico, with 2 Ks, Nicho, and Nichiji. Among them, he specifically appointed Nico, Nikko, as his successor and chief priest of Kuanji Temple on Mount Minobu, which he founded at Minobu. After Nietzsche died, however, divergent opinions developed among the 6 senior priests. Their understandings, the perceptions of what it was he had actually been saying and what was the point and purpose of his teaching. Most of the Nietzschean schools that exist today can trace their roots to this initial division of those 6 senior disciples. The major Nietzschean schools can be classified as follow. The Nikko school, 2 Ks, that's Nietzsche and Shoshu really, right? Nikko left Kuanji Temple on Mount Minobu, and with his disciples established a temple called Taisekuji. Okay, so that's Taisekuji, that's Nietzsche and Shoshu. The next one it mentions here is the Nikko school, or the Minobu school. This is the one that took over as actually the biggest school that, not the biggest school, was at one time during World War II, it was the biggest school. For centuries, it was the biggest school. This is the one that Nico, Niko, headed up by kissing butt with the government. And basically, it became the leading temple of all the Nietzschean schools. So the Nikko school, deriving from Nico, Niko, and his disciples, also called the Minobu school. Okay, and that's he did that with Takagawa shogunate. All right, and then there's the Nichiro school, the Nakayama school, the Nisho school, and then in addition, there's the no alms accepting or Fujifuse school. There's the Fujifuse Kuman school. There's all kinds of schools of Nichiren Buddhism, and they are all basically believe in chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, but an awful lot of them chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo to objects of devotion of like Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay, so it's not what we do as members of Soka philosophy. Okay, so the big thing is that who though did Makaguchi and Toda? How we end up with this connection to Nietzsche and Shoshu, and what is that all about? And where did all of the material that I talk about every week and have been for years and will be for years to come, because there's so much of it, where did all that come from? How could this guy from Anderson, Indiana, be sitting here on a video talking about all of this Japanese history and Japanese philosophy and Nichiren Buddhism? It's all because of the Soka Gakkai. Okay, and it's been initially all translated, probably more than anything else. First of all, the greatest amount of translations and copies of historical content obviously would be in Japanese. But the thing about it is that most of the Japanese that was translated into English got translated into English by priests, okay, that had learned English, and they hadn't learned English very well, frankly. Okay, you also have all the issues of, historically, the truth is that several of the senior priests believed that any of the letters or writings of Nichiren that were being passed on as source references, because they were quite often written in the common language of Japanese rather than the formal language of Chinese, of classical Chinese, they were considered, paisei. We say paisei, I don't know how to say it. It was like sort of like, oh, don't let people know that Nichiren was such a humble person that he didn't write in classical Chinese. So there are a lot of letters and guidances from Nichiren that were destroyed actually by the priesthood, okay, because they didn't want anybody to find out about. The priesthood has had an agenda from day one of sorts, okay? And I'm not putting down the priesthood, because certainly without all those Nichiren schools continuing, we wouldn't have gotten to the point where we are now. But the point where we are now is the modern era. Okay, and the modern era is a time of digital communication that allows me to be sitting here talking in my dining room, okay, and people all over the world hearing what I'm saying. Now that never existed. But the ability of Nichiren to foresee the fact that this teaching would spread throughout Jampadvipa is actually occurring right now, as expressed by even the activity that we're doing at this moment, speaking together, okay, sharing together. So I want to get into, because what's going to happen now in reading, I'm going to read you tonight, or start reading tonight, because it's 30-some pages long. I won't get it all done tonight. And so Mr. Lee might be 2 weeks before I get to your questions. But it's called the Garden of Life chapter. And understand that, again, the way Nichiren Shoshu functioned in terms of the priesthood and in terms of informing the lay people about the teaching was to give what's called okos. And that's what would happen. And when you go to the temple, you go to the local temple, and you would have a priest preach to you and give you a sermon, just like they do in church in the West, where you sit down and the reverend or the minister or whatever, they sit and talk to a congregation of people. People are just sitting there listening. They're not actively doing anything. Now, the thing about that method of transferal of the teaching is that it's limited. Because if you don't practice yourself, and if you don't establish a daily relationship with the law and the teaching itself every day, it's very difficult for a sermon or a speech or somebody's motivational speaking to stay in your mind in such a way that you stay in the high life condition you need to battle the 3 obstacles and the 4 devils when they attack you for practicing correctly. Okay? So, that's why this whole prophecy of Nichiren about the fact that his teaching would spread throughout Jampadvipa. Now again, let's keep this in a historical context. When Nichiren's talking about all of this in 13th century Japan, don't forget, when did Columbus sail the ocean blue and discover the New World? 1492. So as far as everybody knows in Nichiren's time, the world is flat. The concept of Jampadvipa, of the continental or the landmass that he knows as China and extends eastward or westward, they don't know about any kind of separation of oceans or anything like that, okay? So the idea always was in this teaching, even from the Lotus Sutra, that it would be propagated throughout the world, that it was not for just one space, one location, it was for all humankind, okay? So what ended up happening is that, again, after Nichiren's death, all of the schools, and as you can see, this goes Kimpon Hokeshu. There's more schools on top of the ones that I just mentioned. Okay, so they all become very religious in that they're headed up by priests. Lay people around them are not educated. Most of them cannot read. They're farmers. They're common people. I mean, this is the reality of the circumstance of why that structure was necessary at the time and why we've now transcended that structure in the modern era. And what I'm really trying to say is that why is Daisaku Ikeda writing all these? I mean, all of this is based on the Soka philosophy as it relates to the outlook that's being communicated. Okay, and it's because it can be done directly now based on this being the modern era. This doesn't have to be passed down through a hierarchical process. In the 50s, in the 60s, Josei Toda or Daisaku Ikeda or whoever was at the top of the leadership that was trying to convey a message of faith throughout the organization would have to have that message of faith passed from one person to another person to another person. who knows whether or not the clear understanding of how it was intended was how it was actually passed out by the time it got to everybody. Right. Do you understand the liability of that then? So when President Keita starts talking about mentor disciple and emphasizing that, he's not just talking about Daisaku Ikeda and the members of the Soka Gakkai, because that's not what it's all about. That's not what he's talking about. I used to be confused too because I listened to the propaganda instead of investigating it myself. I took it upon myself to find out the truth, and I found out the truth, and I could flip off everybody that gives Daisaku Ikeda a hard time now, because if you studied, if you understood really what's occurred here, there's no way you could have an issue with this. This was absolutely necessary if Kosen Rufu was going to actually occur. Because what do we practice? Okay, when I mentioned those 6 schools, what was the smallest one of the 5 leading schools? The 6th one is a catch-all here. But when I mentioned those first 5 schools, what was the biggest and what was the smallest? Nikko, Nikko in Minobu was the biggest, and Nichiren Shoshu, Nikko, was the smallest. Okay? And the smallest became the biggest because of a lay organization called the Soka Gakkai. And the Soka Gakkai grew not because of the practice of Nichiren Shoshu, but because of the practice of the Soka Gakkai. And that was something that was developed and in a process of confirmation as, that's why it's referred to as a new religion. After the defeat of Japan in World War II, there were a lot of new philosophies that sprang forth. And several of them were based on chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. In Japan, I'm saying. They call them the new religions. Soka Gakkai is considered a new religion. This is a new way of perceiving the Daishonen's teachings. It is not actually in lockstep accord with Nichiren Shoshu, and it never has been. And that's why the consternation that finally occurred in 1990 was bound to occur. If you do your homework, it was bound to occur at some point in time. And it was necessary to occur. So we could be freed up from the yoke of a high priest who thinks that they're superior to us. Right. That all of their benefit is what's being passed down through us. That there's some connection between us and Nichiren that's outside of us. None of that is true in my experience of almost 50 years. And that was never qualified and clearly stated and taught to anybody until the Soka Gakkai. So, I'm not going to read you all this shit about Nichiren Shoshu, but do understand that's the way it went down. You're going to hear about it now as I start to read from the Garden of Life chapter of the Human Revolution. Again, this 2-volume set, this is about, everybody knows about the New Human Revolution. There's 30 some odd volumes of it. That's the story of President Ikeda from 1960 on. This is recounting from President Ikeda through his understanding of many conversations with President Toda, what President Toda went through and was thinking at the various stages of what he experienced in practical life. So I'll be starting tonight on page 403. This is actually multiple chapters in this book. So there's like 4, how many volumes are there in this? They represent the first volumes, 1 through 6 of Ningen Kakume, the Human Revolution. Okay, so it was finally translated. This was translated into a hardback back in and published by World Tribune Press, I think, in 2004. So I couldn't have read this back in the old days when I first started practicing. This is part of the modern thing. I had some guy say that I was, asleep or I don't know, something critical last week. Is that okay? We had an interruption in the broadcast here. Sorry about that. But at any rate, the point is that if you take a look at publications, from the last 3 decades, say the 70s, 80s, and even 70s and 80s in the U.S. It always said NSIC. If somebody wants to talk about publications and what Daisaku Ikeda has or has not had published and whatever. If the publisher was NSIC, do understand that all of those manuscripts and texts had to be approved by the priesthood. NSIC stood for Nichiren Shoshu International Center. So everything that got translated, everything got published outside of Japan had to go through them, and it's sort of like thought police once again. So I don't trust any of those publications. I read them all, by the way, Nutty, whatever your name is. I did read all those. Did you get a lot out of them? You won't get anything out of them compared to what you get out of the things that have been translated since the mid-90s. So, going on to page 403, chapter 4 of Human Revolution, Garden of Life. Are we back on with the other camera yet?
Go ahead.
All right.
We'll post that one.
Okay. Pardon me, starting now here. In the dead of night, Josei Toda was seated in silence, alone at the desk in his study on the second floor of his home. On the desk was a single sheet of manuscript paper with one line on it, The Philosophy of Life by Josei Toda. There was no second line. The rest of the paper had remained bare for hours. This was a rare experience for him. Usually, before setting his pen to paper, Toda would ponder his subject laboriously. Once he started writing, however, he would complete it immediately from beginning to end. Tonight, the situation was different. His thoughts had definitely matured. There was a torrent of ideas raging in his heart. Okay, his thoughts had matured. So this is a process, again, of the growth of each of us as it comes to the realization of our true identity as a bodhisattva of the earth. This is a story of his. What to write about and in what order? Pardon me. His thoughts had definitely matured. There was a torrent of ideas raging in his heart. What to write about and in what order? He had already settled in his mind. He intended to thoroughly clarify the philosophy of life ranging over the three existences by citing first paragraphs from the simile and parable and the parable of the phantom city and lifespan chapters of Lotus Sutra, and then from the selection of time and the opening of the eyes in Nichiren Daishonin's writings. He then planned to elucidate the eternity of life by citing essential parts of the lifespan chapter of the Lotus Sutra, along with supporting passages from Nichiren Daishonin's writings, including the entity of the mystic Hua, the ultimate teaching affirmed by all Buddhas of the past, present, and future on the 10 worlds, as well as the record of the orally transmitted teachings. Finally, what's cool is we've all read all of that. Finally, he would reveal concretely and explicitly how life actually continues to exist. So does everybody understand what I'm saying so far? He sat down to write a new philosophical outlook, merging the reality of experience and understanding of Nichiren Buddhism to create something that would qualify to everybody in the world why Nichiren Buddhism, why the philosophy that he was living was something that superseded all other philosophies that had ever been discussed previously. He says, he felt this would not be too difficult for him. He felt that he would definitely be able to show it all logically. He was going to logically explain, based on all of this existing established criteria, why his argument was correct. Top of page 404. What had caused him to hesitate and ponder everything over and over again. Okay, so he had all the understanding as it related to written word. I mean, theoretical understanding. What had caused him to hesitate and ponder everything over and over again was a misgiving he felt about his ability to approach the absolute existence of life through logical analysis alone. He was well versed in the subject. Deep in his heart, he cherished the profound enlightenment into life that he had reached through his own desperate efforts, talking about his experience in prison. But now he felt greatly perplexed how difficult it was to explain to others. I completely agree. It's not easy to experience when you have a religious experience. How do you put that into words that other people can understand and not think you're a little weird or misunderstand what you're saying? He would nervously remove his glasses and then put them on again. He would light a cigarette and then hastily snuff it out after a few puffs, only to light up another one. Yes, President Totus was a chain smoker, in case you weren't aware of that. Before he knew it, the thick smoke filled the room. He glanced up at the ceiling. This is awful. Putting several small mints in his mouth, he arose and opened a window. It was a May night, and in rushed a fragrance of young leaves. Outside it was still dark. The faraway barking of a dog rendered a feeling of solitude to the evening. He stood alone. He gazed into the night for some time. Then with his hands in the sash of his kimono, he began to pace the floor. He was having a hard time coping with the thoughts churning inside him. As he paced back and forth, an answer dawned on him. On that occasion, too, I was walking the floor of that tiny room, pacing up and down as if I were a caged animal. By that occasion, he meant the time 5 years earlier when he had been imprisoned in a solitary cell at the Tokyo detention house in Sugamo as a wartime thought criminal. His gloomy prison cell had been far narrower than his study on the second floor. Between his cell and the corridor there had been a stout iron-barred door about 1 yard wide. Inside the cell there was a tatami mat area of about 3.5 square yards adjoining a wooden floor area about half that size. In the wall, which faced eastward, was a small window. Thick iron bars in the window separated the cell from the outside world. In the corner, just below the window, was a 3-foot square wooden box with a lid on top of it, making it resemble a small chest. Above this was a shelf, a foot and a half wide and less than a foot in depth, on which one could place books and a vase. About halfway between the shelf and the chest, and to the right of the window, a board projected, resembling a desk. When one raised the desk top, however, it revealed a wash basin. On the chair facing the desk, there was another wooden board. When it was raised, one found a toilet. This chair seat was actually the toilet lid. In his solitary cell, which was simple and efficient, Toda would pace up and down while continuing a deep meditation. Toda had made a resolution to read a part of the Lotus Sutra every day. He had adopted his resolution on January 1st, 1944, and along with it he had vowed to chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo 10,000 times a day. To make matters difficult, the unpunctuated Chinese text of the Lotus Sutra made it extremely laborious to read. On several occasions he had asked that the book be returned to his home, but strangely it always came back to his cell. When he finally realized that this was not due to any malice or intentional negligence on the part of his jailers, once he realized that it was karma trying to bring back something for him to create clarity that he was praying for, he murmured with determination, "All right, I will read it. Yes, by all means, I will start with the Lotus Sutra." So where did he start getting serious? After he'd already been hanging with Tetsuburo Makaguchi, creating the Kyogoku Kai, whatever, right? It was really when he got into prison that he got serious about really understanding the Daishonin's teachings from the depth of his life. And that's what we're discussing now, beginning to understand them from the depth of your life. He's saying he put this resolution into practice beginning that New Year's Day. By the time he had read the unpunctuated Chinese text of the Lotus Sutra 3 times, it was already March. Daily, he chanted more than 10,000 times, making it his goal to chant several hundred at each setting, and also to read a fixed number of pages of the Lotus Sutra. In addition, he carefully read each sentence of Nichiren Daishonin's writings, as if to digest them day after day. He spent 2 months of the severest winter cold in this fashion. One day in early March, while the bitter cold still lingered, he commenced reading the sutra for the 4th time. It begins with the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, as we all know from the Threefold Lotus Sutra that we read, right? This is what I heard. At one time, the Buddha was in Rajagiri, staying on Mount Giradakuta. Accompanying him were a multitude of leading monks numbering 12,000 persons. Josei Toda was already familiar with this scene in which Shakyamuni Buddha expounds the virtuous practices chapter of the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. Then, reaching the verse portion of the chapter which follows the descriptive opening scene and commends the virtues of the Buddha, he concentrated all his attention on the succeeding sentences, thinking, "Now I always fail to grasp the meaning of this." So once again, Josei Toda, after many years of practice, still would find areas where he had to go through a contemplative process of challenging himself, challenging his heart, challenging his capacity to comprehend it correctly. That came from daimoku. That didn't come from thinking about it. Okay? That's how you grasp and overcome these issues that are ponderances. They're ponderances for you. Why? For you. You determined that these would become ponderances for you so that you could realize the things you've already made the cause to realize. Do you follow? Okay, that's like he's saying, once he realized the Lotus Sutra kept coming back, wasn't because the guard was trying to screw with it. It's actually the universe. This is my prayer. We don't see our prayers being answered in the way that they're answered all the freaking time. That's why we got to have the faith to just keep going. And then suddenly we realize, oh, this thing that I didn't even realize was a huge benefit is a huge benefit.
Exactly.
We only get to experience that because of faith.
Yes.
That's the only time a person gets to experience that experience. Okay? Because you kept going when logically you should have been going, why am I doing this? All right? He says, now I always fail to grasp the meaning of this. Now this is from the Lotus Sutra. From that section in the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, the virtuous practices. Great indeed, great sage Lord of enlightenment, without defilement, without stain, without attachment, trainer of heavenly and human beings, elephants and horses, scenting all with the wind of the way, the incense of virtue, calm in wisdom, vast in feeling, still and concentrated in thought, will extinguished, consciousness gone, mind tranquil, eternally cut off from dreamlike deluded thoughts and ponderings. He could comprehend these lines, which were, in short, an admiration of the Buddha, the great sage Lord of great enlightenment, and no more. But the next lines he could not grasp the meaning of in the least. He could only imagine that the word body might possibly signify what the Buddha actually is. This follows immediately after what I just read from the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. His body, neither existing nor not existing, neither caused or conditioned, neither self or other, neither square or round, neither short or long, neither appearing or disappearing, neither born or extinguished, neither created or arising, neither acted or made, neither sitting or lying down, neither walking or standing, neither moving or turning, neither idle or still, neither advancing or retreating, neither in safety or danger, neither right or wrong, neither gaining or losing, neither this or that, neither departing or coming, neither blue or yellow, neither red or white, neither crimson or purple, or any other sort of color. This section consisted of 12 lines in the original Chinese, and he totaled up 34 negatives. The next part, born in precepts, meditation, wisdom, emancipation, insight, ... quotations, is followed by still more praise for the virtues of the Buddha. Then comes an explanation of the Buddha as a physical existence, which is not so difficult to comprehend in terms of the Buddha's concept of manifested body. But he could still not grasp what Shakyamuni was expressing through the 34 negations. The line at the beginning, his body neither existing nor not existing, seemed to mean that the Buddha's body could not simply be defined as existing or not existing. Applying the Buddhist concept of non-substantiality made Toda feel as as if he could understand it, but its real substance still seemed to elude him. If body signifies Dharma body, or the changeless essence of the Buddha, what conclusively is meant by the term? Unless it is clarified, Dharma body is nothing more than an imaginary concept. After all, what is the property of the law? He could hardly believe that Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, the very heart of all Buddhism, could be mere idealism. This could never be, he thought. But in these 12 lines of Chinese, the body of the Buddha is veiled in a mist of idealism. Josei Toda could no longer read this with as much nonchalance as he had the past 3 times. Now, do you understand what he's saying there? Okay. He's saying he could no longer read this with the nonchalance he had for the past 3 times. So this is what happens when we read and we read and we reread the teaching. We read it the first time, oh, we understand it. We read it the second time and we go, oh, we missed that part. And we read it the third time and we go, holy shit, I didn't even perceive this part. I didn't perceive this depth. Okay, so what happens is we can read these goshos. We read them once. We've been practicing 10 years. We got a 10-year understanding. Okay, practice sincerely 20 years. Practice sincerely 30 years. Practice sincerely 40 years. Your understanding will continue to expand. It will not be the same. You will not be bored rereading the same shit you already know, because what you're reading is completely different in terms of the knowledge that you're establishing in your mind from it. Okay? He said he could no longer read this with as much nonchalance as he had the past 3 times. His daily assiduous practice of chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, that's what created the advance. And his awesome determination for reading the Lotus Sutra with his whole life had brought him to a halt. He pondered. So again, he's still contemplating to understand with his life what is the truth. 34 cases of negations are not mere epithets. They must be for clarifying something that actually exists, he thought. But this something is neither existing nor not existing, neither square or round, neither short or long, neither moving or turning or still. It was riddle-like. What could it mean? He could only imagine that there was something of great and absolute being, though not visible, which could be explained only through such a paradoxical expression. He tired of meditation and returned again to the chanting of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. His hands clasped the unusual prayer beads he had fashioned out of milk bottle caps. Everybody knows, he made prayer beads out of milk bottle caps. Toda resolutely desired to achieve a perfect comprehension of the meaning of these 12 mysterious lines, and he therefore determined not to go any further until he was satisfied in his heart that he understood. So he said, I'm reading it the 4th time. I'm going to stop here until I get this part down and understand it, in my mind at least. In a sense, he burned the bridges behind him in the battle to understand the Lotus Sutra. Because he said, if I can't figure this part out, I'm not going to go on. I'm going to continue. I'm going to stay until I figure this part out. His resolution was not mere idealism. It was a decision on which he staked his entire life. It was a determination to master the secret teaching, actually, that exists within this 34 negations, all right? As is well known, a great number of interpretive works, because we do know that as well. All kinds of priests, all kinds of people have lectured on the Lotus Sutra and the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra, and it's Tiantai, Dengyo, Myolo, everybody, right? As is well known, a great number of interpretive works and lectures on the Lotus Sutra had by then been published, but imprisoned in his solitary cell, Toda was not permitted to read such books, nor could he remember ever having read heard or read any explanation of this section of the sutra. So he's stuck there trying to figure this out, but he can't find any source reference materials other than the sutra itself and his own daimoku. Do you understand? Right? So he says, the works would not have helped anyway, since most of them paid no attention to this troubling part, merely repeating verbose and tedious explanations of the preceding or following parts, which are praise of the Buddha, right? Even in those works that did broach the subject, the interpretation was quite superficial, saying only the Buddha is beyond any earthly definition of existence or non-existence, or neither square or round, neither long or short, signifies that the Buddha has nothing to do with any kind of material relationship, and that the Buddha's work transcends all mundane affairs. From our present understanding, such statements are patently absurd. In the history of Buddhism, even the great teachers, Tentai, 13 centuries earlier, the first to fathom the meaning of the Lotus Sutra, did not give a clear interpretation. Everybody's with me, right? Tentai is really the one that qualified 3,000 realms, right? He's the Ichinen Sanzen comes from Tentai. All of this stuff that's saying, and he's the one that categorized all of the teachings and said, no, the perfect teaching is the Lotus and the Nirvana. So it starts with Tentai's interpretation, all right? He says, the orthodoxy of the Tentai school was inherited by the great teacher Dingyo in Japan, and he attempted a line-by-line explanation of the 12 lines in question in a work entitled Interpretation of the Immeasurable Meaning Sutra. He explained the body as revealing the enlightened and defined it only as the physical body of the enlightened, as far from an accurate grasp of its substance. The teachings of the Tentai school are based on threefold contemplation in a single mind and the theoretical elucidation of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life, because they lack Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, which gives the actual elucidation. And thus it may have been impossible to elucidate the verse more clearly. Needless to say, the student priests of the Tendai school accepted Dingyo's words without thinking and defined body as the physical body of the Buddha. They interpreted not as a mere abstractive modifier and considered the body of the Buddha to be something supernatural and beyond human comprehension. If one considers body to be the great sage Lord of enlightenment, with the 12 lines being only exemplifications of the Buddha, then the words great sage Lord of enlightenment lose their substance and become mere idealism. He's going through this contemplative process. Absolutely correct. Since this part of the sutra is the verse that the Mahasattvas offered in perfect accord to the Buddha, naturally the Buddha cannot be a mere ideal. Now again, do you understand where he's going with this? The Soka philosophy says what about each one of us, and what is in all of Nichiren's teaching saying the same thing? You are the Buddha exactly as you are. That didn't exist in Buddhism at the time this was all. Nichiren Buddhism wasn't teaching you're the Buddha. You're going to be the Buddha if you chant your whole life. You'll be reborn. Okay? Do you understand? You're an Oko person. You listen to sermons from priests. This isn't about you achieving Kosen Rufu. That's not what you did as a practitioner of Nichiren Buddhism in any of the other schools. Do you understand? So he's saying, again, so if you're the Buddha, are you an ideal? No, you're a real human being. Okay, that's where this is headed. He's saying, Toda's going, naturally, the Buddha cannot be a mere ideal. This is the contemplative process he's going through and figuring this out. The key to understanding the 12 incomprehensible lines was to Toda to identify body at the beginning of the verse. If the verse is regarded as outlining only the physical property of the Buddha, the meaning will be distorted. Also, if the Buddha indicates an entity mysterious beyond imagination, then it follows that the Buddha exists only beyond reality. Toda, however, was certain intuitively that the 12 lines suggested the existence of something of real substance. He continued chanting, ceaselessly trying to come to the true meaning of body. He fell into a deep meditation, recalling each of the 34 negations one after the other, trying to imagine what it might be that could absolutely exist despite so many negational words. He was no longer conscious of the passing time and completely forgot where he was. The word life flashed through his mind, and in an instant he arrived at a complete awareness of the meaning of the 12 mystic lines. Life is neither existing nor not existing, neither caused or conditioned, neither self or other, neither square or round, neither short or long, neither crimson or purple or any other sort of color. In other words, I just now switched life for body in the same word, sentences, right? He says, is not body none other than life? If we realize this, then nothing is mystic or mysterious. It is now obvious that the Buddha means life itself. This is the Soka philosophy. Okay? This is the Soka philosophy. Toda rose to his feet. He did not in the least feel the bitter cold of the cell and was completely unaware of the time. Breathing deeply with rosy cheeks and glowing eyes, filled with a boundless joy, he began to walk back and forth. And if I start crying while I'm reading the rest of this, I'm sorry, I can't get through this. I've been trying for a few days. It was a tiny cell. He paced up and down in a self-possessed manner, his emaciated shoulders braced upright and his fists clenched tight. Buddha is both life itself and an expression of life. Mutual. It does not exist outside ourselves, but within our lives. No, it exists outside our lives as well. It is the life of the entire universe. Everything inherently possesses Buddhahood. And we can tap it by chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo to the Gohonzon. He wanted to cry out to everyone, to anyone. In that instance, his narrow cell seemed to expand infinitely. When his excitement subsided, he seated himself upright, conjuring up the image of the Gohonzon. As the twilight deepened, he commenced a serene chanting of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. Now he's going to talk about something that I've experienced myself as well. So this isn't made up. This isn't bullshit. This does happen, I can tell you. In a brief moment of enlightenment, Toda reached the threshold of a thought development that will someday revolutionize the world's philosophy. So this is Daisaku Ikeda again, predicting that President Toda, in this moment of clarity, qualified the underpinnings that will become the Soka philosophy, which will ultimately achieve Kosen Rufu and affect all of the philosophical outlooks of all philosophies in the whole world. In a brief moment of enlightenment, Toda reached the threshold of a thought development that will someday revolutionize the world's philosophies. The achievement was his, for no direct mention of human life as such is to be found in the Lotus Sutra. By uncovering the meaning of the 12 enigmatic lines, Toda grasped the true aspect of Buddhahood as life existing within cosmic life and in the lives of human beings. No God, no beginning, no end, everything connected together. Science. This universal life force pervades all things in all three stages of existence, past, present, and future. By instilling in Buddhist thought a fresh interpretation, he proved two immensely significant things. First, he showed that the life philosophy of Buddhism is more than equal for modern scientific thought. Second, he revealed the life philosophy as set forth by Nichiren. Second, he revealed the life philosophy as set forth by Nichiren Daishonin is superior to all other philosophies of the ancient and modern worlds. With this newfound realization, Toda continued to read the Lotus Sutra, mastering one chapter after another, chapters with many difficult phrases that had previously remained obtruse and difficult to comprehend. And once again, that's what happens after you read. You're going to find the parts that you didn't understand. Now suddenly you do understand. And then the third time, you understand them more deeply. And the fourth time, you understand them where you never began to understand them before. That's what this is all about. While still in prison, Toda watched spring and then summer pass. Now, autumn was drawing to a close. His untiring contemplation during this entire period enabled him to understand clearly almost every phrase and sentence in the sutra. One basic question, however, continued to nag him. What on earth did Shakyamuni seek to reveal with the 28 chapters of the Lotus Sutra? This became the second question to plague him. If the zenith of Shakyamuni's teachings was during his lifetime was the Lotus Sutra, according to Chentai and his, qualification of him, what is the heart of this supreme teaching, Lotus Sutra? This heart must be, logically speaking, the great law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo expounded by Nichiren Daishonin, and also the Gohonzon of the mutual possession of the 10 worlds inscribed by him for the sake of all people of the latter day of the law. This was the natural conclusion, but the realization came to him that he had yet to grasp it as an incontrovertible fact. In his chilly and solitary cell, he would often find himself talking aloud. From his tiny window, Toda could see the clear autumn sky. Gazing toward this sky, he would remain in a state of abstraction for hours. Sleeping or awake, the question remained with him. What is the truth of the Lotus Sutra, and how can I prove it concretely? The problem posed by this question caused him the severest agonies he had ever experienced. If one takes the Lotus Sutra, and this is all very logical questions he's asking himself and answering and seeking to answer for the sake of not only himself but for others. If one takes the Lotus Sutra as a mere fable told by Shakyamuni, because it's pretty out there, right? It can be said that it is no more than a clever fairy tale concocted in ancient India. In his writings, however, Nichiren Daishonin came to the conclusion that each of the 69,384 Chinese ideographs used in the Lotus Sutra is a Buddha. Thus, everything mentioned in the Lotus Sutra must be true. Nichiren Daishonin must have comprehended everything, but his unworthy disciple Josei Toda could not. His environment was without mercy, an imprisoned life in wartime. Even while suffering from malnutrition, Toda refused to give up his intense bouts of concentration. In extreme fatigue, his clothes hanging loosely on his wretched body with scant flesh remaining, he devoted himself to chanting. By mid-November, the number of times he had chanted Nam-myoho Renge-kyo with determination since New Year's Day reached the 2 million mark. On the top of page 411 for those of you that might have had this. Continuing. One morning, basking in early sunshine that somehow found its way through the tiny cell window, he was chanting in a clear voice, the sound disappearing into the cell air outside, into the clear air outside. Of what was he thinking? Nothing in particular. Perhaps of his business, which was on the verge of bankruptcy, or of his chafing to be free of prison as soon as possible, or of his greatly distressed family, or of his venerable old mentor, Tanesaburo Makaguchi, who was in the same prison. But no, all of these thoughts had disappeared from his mind. If there was anything at all, it was the 15th chapter of the Lotus Sutra emerging from the earth, which he had been reading over and over again for several days. It had taken up residence in a corner of his mind. The sun provided warmth, and a gentle breeze reminded him of the peace of spring as it caressed his cheeks. He felt as though an indescribable delight in living were flowing from his body. He felt enveloped in a peaceful, quiet, and endless shroud of emotion which seemed to be washing away all of his worries and sufferings. When these bodhisattvas, President Todas, this is a quotation, when these bodhisattvas heard the voice of Shakyamuni Buddha speaking, they came up from below. Each one of these bodhisattvas was the leader of his own great assembly, and each brought with him a retinue equal in number to the sands of 60,000 Ganges, to say nothing of those who brought retinues equal to the sands of 50,000, 40,000, 30,000, 20,000, or 10,000 Ganges. Pardon me. This is the most important part. I'll wait for you to sit. Okay, he's been reading Emerging from the Earth. He's been doing this serious contemplative thing, right? Trying to figure it out, figure it out, figure it out. This is the story of what he experienced. You'd see it if you saw the movie. In an instant, Toda found himself in the air. Now, I won't tell you my personal experience, but I've had a very similar thing like this. At the beginning of my practice, it was probably the foundation of my practice, because after that experience, there was no doubt in my mind I was on the right track and I was doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. So I know that this kind of experience can occur. This is not a made-up fairy tale. It's not an incomprehensible thing. It's a metaphysical kind of a thing. That's why you don't talk about it to other people very much, because you can't prove it and it's personal. But President Toda's having it shared by President Ikeda in the writing of this book. Okay? In an instant, Toda found himself in the air, in a huge crowd of people, numbering as many as the sands of 60,000 Ganges rivers, all worshiping the Gohonzon. Now I found myself in outer space, in the blackness of space, with this gigantic golden lit Gohonzon and these innumerable voices behind me chanting Daimoku. Okay, now I never looked back to see who was behind me, because as soon as I saw that gigantic Gohonzon, I knew exactly what the hell was going on. Okay, and then I experienced, this only lasted for a minute, so I didn't think I was at the ceremony in the air. I don't know what I experienced. I was in space floating, okay? But this is President Toda's experience. It was neither dream or illusion. It seemed as if it only lasted only a few seconds or perhaps a few minutes, or again, as long as several hours. Exactly what I felt. It was to Toda a firm reality that he was experiencing for the first time. It was for me as well. As supreme jubilation filled his body, he cried to himself that the experience was without falsity, and that he had actually been part of it all. At that moment, he came to himself, seated in his narrow prison cell in the morning sunshine. Back to where... What the hell just happened?
Right.
Okay? But you never forget that. I can clearly see it in my mind to this day. You know, almost 50 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. At that moment, he came to himself, seated in his narrow prison cell in the morning sunshine. Stricken dumb with surprise at the experience, Toda shed tears of joy. He removed his glasses and pressed a towel to his face, but it was impossible to restrain his tears. An overflowing delight permeated his entire life and being. And by the way, I was also chanting Daimoku about Buddhahood and about my mission as a bodhisattva of the earth. That didn't happen while, casually. With tears, same thing, with tears streaming down his face, he read the passage, "The assembly on Eagle Peak has not yet been dispersed." What had he witnessed? He recalled the lines from the Gosho. Nichiren was without doubt directly bequeathed these three great secret laws from the Lord Buddha as the supreme leader of all the bodhisattvas of the earth more than 2 millennia ago. That's from the Gosho. Toda was almost delirious with joy. Each time he read Nichiren Daishonen's writing called The Three Great Secret Laws, he had always been perplexed by the term directly bequeathed. Now he found, however, that this was no imaginary ceremony at all, or act. I myself must have been one of those people numbering as many as the sands of 60,000 Ganges rivers, and Nichiren Daishonin must have been the supreme leader on that occasion, he thought. What a solemn, brilliant ceremony held at a time without beginning. Kuan Ganjo. So in fact, I myself am a bodhisattva of the earth. That's the realization that triggered all of this. I myself, I am a bodhisattva. It's not just a name, it's not just words, it's the truth. It's who I am. It's what I must be. He paced the tiny cell. He went back to his small desk, sat himself down, and resumed reading the Emerging from the Earth chapter. He tapped his fingers on his desk and nodded deeply to himself. Yes, it was exactly this way. He went straight into the lifespan of the Thus Come One chapter. Then he read through the remaining 8 chapters which described the transfer process and reached the entrustment chapter. The ideographs from each chapter instantly became familiar and summoned him as if he were reading once again a notebook he had kept. Words that formerly had seemed so ambiguous became obvious and comprehensible. He could not believe his own eyes, but he did not marvel in the least at how he had come to fathom this great mystery. With fierce and intense emotion, he declared in his heart, "Excellent! My life was destined for this. I will never forget this most precious day. I will complete the purpose of my life only by propagating this magnificent Buddhist teaching." He had been awakened to his mission, thinking of the time. Pardon me. I know I wouldn't make it. He had been awakened to his mission, thinking of the time and of the future to come. He realized that he was already 45. He remembered from the Meiji era, during which he was born, the system of dividing a man's age into decades, a system by which Confucius, gauging his own life, expounded the harmony of a person's age and a relevant credo. At 40, freed from vacillation. At 50, no heaven's decree was the slogan. Toda at 45 belonged to neither of those, but he had acquired them both at once. Pacing about his cell, he declared, "Freed from vacillation 5 years late, and new heaven's decree 5 years early." One of the jailers now, who happened to hear Toda speaking, stared dubiously into his cell. Then he turned and left. In a solitary cell in another part of the detention center, Tanesaburo Makaguchi lay ill. With his advancing age, he had become weaker and he was suffering from 18 months of malnutrition. On November 17th, 1944, he was moved to the infirmary, and on the next day he peacefully closed his 73 years of life, a life dedicated to this sublime mission. It was not until January 8th of the next year, or 51 days later, that Josei Toda learned of his revered mentor's death. On that day, he was informed of Makaguchi's death by an examining judge at a preliminary court of inquiry. Toda was beside himself. He wailed and mourned bitterly. He wept until there were no more tears. Awakened to his own precious mission, however, he vowed vengeance by accomplishing the great mission of achieving the widespread of Buddhism. Toda was released on bail on July 3rd, 1945. When he set about on the first step of reconstructing the Sokogai, he put aside the philosophy of value of the late president and began by lecturing on the Lotus Sutra to several of his friends. He wished to convey to his fellow members his own realization and sense of mission achieved while in prison, and to call upon them to prepare to realize the true mission of Kosen Rufu. I'll stop there. Page 413. I'll start again next week. Pardon me, I got schmutz all over me. Sorry. Thank you so much for sharing tonight. Appreciate it. See you next week.